Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter
Welcome
day.
to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Mike Schreiner, who is the leader of the Green Party of Ontario. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, Steve, it's a real pleasure to be on.
Well, it's unusual that we get out-of-town guests, and so you're the member from Guelph.
That's right.
Now, give us some background, just some of your personal history. Where'd you grow up, and tell us a little bit about those early days.
Sure. Well, first, Steve, I just want everyone to know it's great to be in Thunder Bay, and I was at the Northwest Ontario Municipal Association meetings, and it was fantastic to meet everybody in person again.
Yes, no
After these
kidding.
years of being on Zoom, and so it's a real honor to join you in the studio here today. I'm a farm kid from rural Western Kansas. I like to say to people all the time that I grew up in the middle of nowhere on a farm, but you come up to Northern Ontario and a lot of people could say, hey, I grew up in the middle of nowhere.
Exactly.
So my parents had a grain and cattle farm, and I moved to Ontario when in my mid to late 20s for love, and fell in love with Ontario and never left.
Terrific. And so, what did you do before politics?
Yeah, so I food entrepreneur. So having grown up on a farm, food and farming is a dear passion of mine. So I started one of Ontario's first local organic food distribution companies in Guelph in the 1995, 1996, when I was still in my 20s. So I was a pretty young entrepreneur. I also ran a food production business for a while, located in Guelph as well. I've co-founded a nonprofit organization to promote local food and farmers, which gave me the opportunity to travel all around Ontario, including to Thunder Bay at the time, because there was a great food co-op here that was not only doing wonderful work here in Thunder Bay, but also making sure food was distributed to remote communities as well. So we did some work with that organization. In the course of doing that, I was really all about how do we build local sustainable food systems that are good for farmers, good for people, good for the environment? And we kept running into some policy challenges that really needed addressing at Queen's Park. And I was somebody who've always been interested in politics. And people around me, my family, my kids, all said, Dad, you got to get back into politics. And I found a home with the Green Party as it represented my values. And so my work as an entrepreneur and a leader in the nonprofit sector was just sort of almost a natural evolution into running for office.
So when did you first run for office?
Yeah, I ran for the first time in 2009. There was a by-election, and the Green Party asked me if I would be their candidate in the by-election. And I didn't live in the riding or anything like that. I had some connections there with a lot of the farmers I'd worked with in the riding. And I did well. I got third place, which for the Green Party at that time was like, whoa, that's a huge success. And I'd also been doing volunteer work for the Green Party, so I helped write their 2007 election platform. And so people came to me after I did so well in the by-election and said, hey, our leader of 16 years is thinking of stepping down. You should think about running for leader. So I ran for leader. And my first election as leader was in the 2011 provincial election. We did okay, but we were still a young party. No Green had been elected in the country yet. By the time the 2014 election rolled around, Elizabeth May had been elected federally, and the Green Party was really on the rise. And we did much better in the 2014 election. I came very close to winning my seat in Guelph. Not quite there yet, but by the time the 2018 election rolled around, we won our first seat in Ontario, and I'm the first member elected to the provincial legislature from a fourth party since the 1940s. So it's always been Liberal or Conservative or NDP members. But back in the 1940s, there was a member elected from another party. And so I was the first one in, oh my gosh, a long time, like about 60 years or so, 60, 70 years. And the legislature took a bit of time for everyone to adjust to the fact that we now have four parties at Queen's Park.
So it sounds like you had some specific policies that you wanted to pursue around food and food distribution. Have you made some progress on what are those? What are the changes you wanted to bring in, and have you had any success on those yet?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the level and support for and availability of local sustainably grown food is much greater today than it was when I first entered into politics. And there are things like Local Food Week, there's funding for local food processing, food distribution, food hubs, things like that. So I think there's a much greater awareness and recognition and importance of supporting local food and farming. We're starting to backtrack a little bit right now in Ontario because of the current government's sprawl agenda, which is going to pave over a lot of the farmland that grows our food and contributes $50 billion to the provincial economy. And so when people hear me speak so passionately at Queen's Park about the importance of protecting farmland and the profitability of local family farmers, it comes from the heart, and it comes from a lifetime of either growing up on a farm or supporting local food and farmers. But I would say that the three big issues that really attracted me to the Green Party and really engaged me in politics was, one, making sure the province is ready to succeed in the new climate economy, and that we take the actions necessary to address the climate crisis and make sure our communities are ready for the impacts of the climate crisis. The second one for me is addressing inequality, and it's why I'm such a passionate advocate, for example, of doubling social assistance rates and ending legislated poverty in Ontario. I think it's a real measure of who we are as a province and how we take care of the most vulnerable in our communities. And the third one for me is improving democracy. I'm a real big believer in local democracy, and it's one of the reasons I really admire how many efforts there's been, particularly in Northwestern Ontario, to say, hey, we deserve a bigger voice in politics, and not all the decisions made for our community should be made, down at Queen's Park. We need a little bit more local democracy here as well. And I'm a big believer in that, and a strong supporter for things like electoral reform to improve our democracy. And I felt the Green Party really reflected those values, and so that's why I decided to volunteer and in some ways bring my entrepreneurial skills to the Green Party to help grow a fourth party in the province.
Well, it's interesting. I ran provincially in 2011 and pretty much had those three main priorities. I was really focusing on the democracy and the inequality pieces myself. And I'm just not sure we've made any progress, in those last 12 years on those fronts. Let's go to the inequality one first. You talked about doubling the social assistance rates for folks on Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program. What's the economic argument for that?
Well, first of all, we know poverty costs this province $33 billion a year. In increased healthcare costs, criminal justice costs, first responder costs, lots of challenges within downtown business districts now. I can't tell you how many small businesses talk to me about just the intersection of poverty, homelessness, mental health, and addiction, and how that's negatively impacting downtowns and especially small businesses. And so I think we all benefit when we take care of the most vulnerable in our community. And the bottom line is it would cost way less than $33 billion a year to double social assistance rates. So not only are we improving the quality of life for people, but we're also helping the province save money in other ways.
Hang on to that thought. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to be right back.
Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter
Welcome back to Community Conversations. My guest today is Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Green Party of Ontario, and we're just talking about inequality in our society. And Mike, you talk about really poverty costs us $33 billion. So here we've got a government that seems to be really focused on that bottom line, on a lot of issues. Why aren't they moving forward? What is it that they can't see that benefit, the economic benefit to our community and to our society?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's hard for some people in government to recognize that you have to spend a little bit of money up front to save money over time. And I can tell you, sometimes people say, government should be run more like a business. And I don't necessarily think that's the case, because somebody longtime business owner myself, running a business and being in government is very different. But one of the things business owners know that I think government could learn from is sometimes you make investments and there's going to be a return on that investment. And I believe addressing poverty is making an investment in people and communities, and the return on that investment is higher quality of life, more thriving communities, and we save that $33 billion that poverty is costing the province. And so why some folks don't see that, I think it's because they're looking short term instead of long term.
Just like, what can the budget handle in this go around? Is that kind of what it comes down to? Or?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also sometimes there's easy populist appeals that can be made. So for example, I'm the only MPP in the entire legislature that voted against what I call the license plate gimmick, that took your $120 off your license plate registration fee. That cost the province over $2 billion the first year it was implemented, and it's costing us over $1.2 billion each and every year. So that's money that disproportionately actually benefited wealthier households because they own more cars. There was one person I think got $30,000 in rebates. Can you imagine owning that many cars? I couldn't believe it. I'm like, how many cars does this person own? But anyway, that's money that could make sure that we're taking care of the most vulnerable in our communities. That nurses get a raise. My gosh, nurses and frontline healthcare workers have had their wages frozen after everything they've done for our communities during the pandemic. And so a lot of it's about the kind of investment priorities that you're going to make. And I'm always looking at how government can make investments that improve quality of life and have a return on investment that includes thriving communities and healthier people.
So another one of your priorities was democracy and promoting democracy. And this is also a subject that's near and dear to me. And I think about democracy is really citizen participation. Lots of people think it's you go to vote once every 4 years. But what we see is that fewer and fewer people are even taking that one step to go and vote. But I think there's that bigger picture. It feels like a lot of people are kind of going, what's the use? No one's going to pay attention to me, which then lowers their desire to be engaged. And then let's just look out for my little piece of the world rather than our whole community and our environment and our society. What's your take on that? And how can we really promote democracy effectively here in Ontario?
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned that this isn't just an issue in Ontario. It's an issue we're seeing really around the world, but especially in North America, where you're seeing declining citizen engagement, declining participation in politics, lower voter turnout. And those people who are engaged seem to be much more polarized and a lot more angry arguments back and forth instead of having civil conversations around how we can improve people's lives. And so I think one of the things that would help with that is changing our electoral system here and bringing in what you would be called proportional representation, which really is just another way of saying that the way people vote, that's what Parliament should look like. As an example, right now, the current Conservative government got 40% of the vote. They have 100% of the power provincially. Federally, the Liberal government got 38% of the vote. They have 100% of the power. And that doesn't reflect the democratic will of the voters. As a matter of fact, Doug Ford, if you look at eligible voters, only 17.6% of eligible voters voted for the Conservative Party in the last provincial election. Yet they have a commanding majority at Queen's Park. And so I think when you see those kinds of distortions in our electoral system, it discourages people from voting because they don't feel like their vote counts. And that affects people from all parties. So if you're a Conservative who lives in downtown Toronto, where people tend to never vote Conservative, it's like, why even bother voting? Or if you live in, a rural riding that typically votes Conservative, a lot of Green, Liberal, or NDP voters may say, well, why bother voting? because, you know, my candidate's not going to be elected or the party I support is not going to be elected. And so I think if we had a voting system like many European countries have and most Western democracies have, where Parliament actually reflects the democratic will of the people, I think you'd see higher voter turnout. You certainly see higher voter turnout in those countries. And you also see less hyperpartisanship in those countries because political parties have to work together. And actually that creates oftentimes more stability within government. Sometimes there's this myth that, you know, if you have minority governments, they're unstable. Well, in many Western democracies, minority governments are very common and very stable because the parties have figured out how to work with each other. Mm-hmm. And I think we could use a bit more of that in Canada.
Well, I totally agree on that, and so I'm active in our community around equity issues.
Oh,
well, one for injured and disabled workers, and around poverty. And we go to the government, and they won't even meet with us.
Yeah.
They won't even talk to us, and you kind of go, no, wait. I thought democracy was that everyone can actually participate. Where really they're saying, if you don't agree with us, we're not going to talk to you.
Yeah.
You know, and I kind of go, where are we going? I mean, that shows in a way that polarized piece that you were talking about before. What's the path away from that?
Well, I do think if we had a voting system that recognized the democratic will of the public, political parties couldn't get away with that because they couldn't take voters for granted, especially in certain ridings. But I will say some of it really comes on to the responsibility of elected officials. And maybe it's just the way I operate, but I meet with people whether they voted for me or not, whether they agree with me or not. I actually think it's important for me to meet with people and listen to people who disagree with me. And a good example of that more recently is I've been supportive of vaccines. I'm vaccinated myself during the COVID pandemic and was a vocal supporter of that. But I still respect people who chose not to be vaccinated and met with those folks and had conversations to have a better understanding, even though that was a very polarizing and has been a very polarizing issue. But I think we can help reduce the levels of polarization, particularly as elected officials, if we take it upon ourselves the responsibility of actually meeting with our constituents and ensuring that we represent all constituents, even those who we may disagree with.
And you know, it's interesting because in a way I started this show to actually have some of those conversations, to try to find ways to reduce the polarization, you know, to that we're both actually human beings sitting here together, and we don't have to agree, but to be able to share together is one of those steps forward, I think, both to address the issue of inequality as well as democracy.
Yep.
But now we got to take another short break, and please stay with us. We're going to be right back.
Working together to make a better community. We can create.
Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Mike Schreiner. He's the MPP for Guelph, and he's the leader of the Ontario Green Party in town for a special occasion. So, Mike, the third priority you talked about was the climate crisis. Where are we at, and where are we going, and what can we do from your angle?
Well, see, I wish I had a more hopeful story for you, because unfortunately in Canada, climate pollution continues to go up. Here in Ontario, it started to go down with the coal phase out, which, you know, Atikokan's a great example of that. But now climate pollution is starting to go up again in Ontario under the current government. And Northwestern Ontario in particular has been really impacted. I mean, we've seen the forest fires, the flooding, the freeze-thaw cycles and what it's doing to our roads and public infrastructure. As a matter of fact, I asked the Financial Accountability Officer to do a study of climate risk to public infrastructure. And just over the next 7 years, this decade alone, an additional cost of $26.2 billion of just public infrastructure. So we're talking, you know, water main lines, sewers, buildings, and the biggest chunk of it being transportation. And so it's affecting us right now. And unfortunately, we're not taking the actions we need to do to reduce climate pollution. But let me give you the good news. The good news is that last year globally, $1.1 trillion were invested in climate economy, jobs, and businesses. I want Ontario to attract that. The number one area of investment was in renewable energy. We have huge opportunities, particularly in the north. I mean, Thunder Bay, I was pleasantly surprised to learn, is one of the best places for solar installations because you have so many sunny days here, and sunny days in cool weather, actually solar is more efficient. So Thunder Bay is a perfect place to do solar. Lots of great hydroelectric opportunities, wind energy opportunities, and those are the lowest cost sources of electricity now. So while the current government is looking at ramping up gas plants, which will increase pollution, it's also going to increase costs for us because wind, solar, and water power is far cheaper now. So we are seeing some good news in additional investments in Ontario in electric vehicle manufacturing, and we have a huge opportunity for a mining to manufacturing electric vehicle supply chain. But here in northwestern Ontario, we better make sure we get that mining right in ways that protect the environment and also respect Indigenous rights to free, informed, and prior consent, and that we have a robust consultation process as we develop critical minerals mining. And then the third area that doesn't get talked about enough is the opportunity to retrofit our buildings to make them more energy efficient, which will help people save money by saving energy, creating thousands of jobs, and also creates a huge opportunity for Ontario to be manufacturing and installing heat pumps, which has seen double-digit growth around the world over the last couple of years. So, you know, the not so good news is we're feeling the impacts of the climate crisis, and we're going to have to make some investments to make sure we protect people and property and public infrastructure. But the opportunity side of thing is that we can be global leaders in creating better jobs, new career opportunities, and generating prosperity for Ontario. And that's the kind of prosperity we need to invest in, you know, high quality public health care, education, and other social services.
So you touched on the issue of mining, and this is, you know, a big deal here in the Northwest. And you talked about Indigenous rights. And, you know, the one thing I've learned that I've become very hopeful is that a number of the Indigenous communities are saying, okay, if you're going to mine in our territory, we need to talk.
Yep.
We need to plan so that it's really going to benefit our people and our communities, which our history has nothing to do like that.
That's right.
Every time a mine comes up, the politicians go, yeah, jobs, without really a consideration for how long those jobs might be, what the impact might be of the mine closing down. And so we've got towns all over the north.
That's right.
That are boom and bust.
Yep.
People come to get the good jobs, and then 20 years later, the mine's gone and their house is now worth nothing.
That's right.
And the community they've gone to establish together is all dispersed. Is there a different way? Is there another way that we can do economic development where we actually start thinking about that bigger picture rather than just jobs?
Yeah, so I think there are some critically important elements to that. One is to have proper land use planning done ahead of time. So we plan out the infrastructure, because the infrastructure that can be built not only can benefit mines, but can benefit communities, especially remote communities. Two, it is absolutely critical that we have, go through our duty to consult, but not as a let's check the boxes exercise, but an exercise of true partnership, an exercise that ensures free, informed, and prior consent, and an exercise that ensures shared prosperity through shared ownership. And when I meet with Indigenous leaders, that's oftentimes what I hear is we're not opposed to mining, we're not opposed to resource development. Let's just do it in a way that protects the land and the water and the wildlife and the people who live here. And let's do it in a way that ensures that everyone receives economic benefits from it. And I've been meeting increasingly with mining companies that are engaged in that process of saying, yes, we want Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples and communities to be full partners with us in developing these projects. And the other thing that is happening in Ontario is, especially in the Sudbury region, is we've just really started increasingly developing Ontario as a hub for sustainable mining. And that can be things like electrifying mining vehicles, which not only reduces climate pollution, but also increases safety because you don't have to worry about the ventilation in the mines. So there are better practices that I think we can be global leaders in. And as we make this transition to a clean economy that addresses the climate crisis, we have to make sure everything from the mining all the way through the supply chains and the manufacturing process, that we're doing it in a way that is sustainable for people and the environment.
So that sounds like, in a way, a transition in terms of normal kind of business practices, which we see is just what's the profit in this quarter or this year, and not really looking that much further ahead. You think government's going to catch on to that philosophy?
Well, a green government would certainly catch on to that philosophy, which is why I work really long, hard hours, and why I was so excited to speak to the Northwestern Ontario Municipal Association. And I actually was just outlining kind of our vision of how Northwestern Ontario can benefit from the new climate economy, creating more jobs and prosperity, and doing it in a way that makes sure that we protect the people who live here.
So, Mike, we're just about out of time. If people want to get a hold of you and find out more about what you're doing and what the Green Party is doing, what's the best way to do that?
Well, you can always go to our website, which is pretty easy to find, gpo.ca.
Say it slowly.
Yeah, GPO, as in Green Party of Ontario.ca. Okay. So gpo.ca. You can follow me on social media, just Mike Schreiner. Generally, most of my social media handles, but it's pretty easy to get a hold of MPPs. I think if you go into any search engine, it's pretty easy to figure out ways to get in contact with members of provincial parliament. We want people to reach out because I'm a deep believer in people power and citizen engagement, and I want to have those conversations with people.
Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show. Sure appreciate it. And to our viewers, you can catch us on Facebook as well and YouTube. Please stay safe, and we'll see you again next week.